Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. Today we're going to do part 2 of Little Blue Book number 42, titled The Origin of the Human Race, written by G. Schwalbe. Whoever G. Schwalbe is. Google him. Okay, here we go. We're going to back it up a sentence here. Some of these characteristics are examined in detail, and it is shown that the arguments drawn from them are not conclusive. Man alone is said to be capable of progressive improvement, but against this must be placed as something analogous in animals the fact that they learn cunning and caution through long-continued persecution. Even the use of tools is not in itself peculiar to man. Monkeys use sticks, stones, and twigs. But man alone fashions and uses implements designed for a special purpose. In this connection, the remarks taken from Lubbock in regard to the origin and gradual development of the earliest flint implements will be read with interest. These are similar to the observations on modern Elios, and their bearing on the development of the stone industry. It is interesting to learn from a letter to Hooker that Darwin himself at first doubted whether the stone implements discovered by Boucher de Perthes, boy, that's a weird name, were really of the nature of tools. With the relentless candor as to himself which characterized him, he writes 4 years later in a letter to Lyell in regard to this view of Boucher de Perth's discoveries. I know something about his errors, and looked at his book many years ago, and am ashamed to think that I concluded the whole was rubbish. Yet he has done for man something like what Agassiz did for glaciers. The return to Darwin's further comparisons between the higher mental powers of man and animals. He takes much of the force from the argument that man alone is capable of abstraction and self-consciousness by his own observations of dogs. One of the main differences between man and animals, speech, receives, turning of the page. Receives the page turn. No. Receives tailed treatment. Pardon the pun. He points out that various animals, birds, monkeys, dogs, have a large number of different sounds for different emotions. That further, man produces in common with animals a whole series of inarticulate cries combined with gestures, and that dogs learn to understand whole sentences of human speech. In regard to human languages, Darwin expresses a view contrary to that held by Max Muller. I cannot doubt that language owes its origin to the imitation and modification of various natural sounds, the voices of other animals, and man's own instinctive cries, aided by signs and gestures. The development of actual language presupposes a higher degree of intelligence than is found in any kind of ape. Darwin remarks on this point. The fact of the higher apes not using their vocal organs for speech no doubt depends on their intelligence not having been sufficiently advanced. The sense of beauty, too, has been alleged to be peculiar to man. In refutation of this assertion, Darwin points to the decorative colors of birds which are used for display, and to the last objection that man alone has religion, that he alone has a belief in God. It is answered that numerous races have existed and still exist, who have no idea of one or more gods, and who have no words in their language to express such an idea. The result of the investigations recorded in this chapter is to show that great as the difference in mental powers between man and the higher animals may be, it is undoubtedly only a difference of degree and not of kind. In the 4th chapter, Darwin deals with the moral sense or conscience. which is the most important of all differences between man and animals. It is a result of social instincts which lead to sympathy for other members of the same society, to non-egotistic actions for the good of others. Darwin shows that social tendencies are found among many animals and that among these love and kin sympathy exist, and he gives examples of animals, especially dogs, which may exhibit characters that we should call moral in man. Examples are disinterested self-sacrifice for the sake of others. The early ape-like progenitors of the human race were undoubtedly social. With the increase of intelligence, the moral sense develops farther. With the acquisition of speech, public opinion arises, and finally moral sense becomes habit. The rest of Darwin's detailed discussions on moral philosophy may be passed over. The 5th chapter may be very briefly summarized. In it, Darwin shows that the intellectual and moral faculties are perfected through natural selection. He inquires how it can come about that a tribe at a low level of evolution attains to a higher, although the best and bravest among them often pay for their fidelity and courage with their lives without leaving any descendants. In this case, it is the sentiment of glory, praise, and blame, the admiration of others, which bring about the increase of the better members of the tribe. Property, fixed dwellings, and the association of families into a community are also indispensable requirements for civilization. In the longer 2nd section of the 5th chapter, Darwin acts mainly as recorder, on the basis of numerous investigations, especially those of Gregg, Wallace, and Galton. He inquires how far the influence of natural selection can be demonstrated in regard to civilized nations. In the final section, which deals with the proofs that all civilized nations were once barbarians, Darwin again uses the results gained by other investigators, such as Lubbock and Taylor. There are 2 sets of facts which prove the proposition in question. In the first place, we find traces of a former lower state in the customs and beliefs of all civilized nations. And in the second place, there are proofs to show that savage races are independently able to raise themselves a few steps in the scale of civilization, and that they have thus raised themselves. In the 6th chapter of the work, morphology comes into the foreground once more. Darwin first goes back, however, to the argument based on the great difference between the mental powers of the highest animal and those of man. That is only quantitative, not qualitative. He has already shown. Very instructive in this connection is the reference to the enormous difference in mental powers in an other class. No one would draw from the fact that the cochineal insect and the ant exhibit enormous differences in their mental powers, the conclusion that the ant should therefore be regarded as something quite distinct and withdrawn from the class of insects altogether. Darwin next attempts to establish the specific genealogical tree of man and carefully weighs the differences and resemblances between the different families of the primates. The erect position of man is an adaptive character, just as are the various characters referable to aquatic life in the seals, which, notwithstanding these, are ranked as a mere family of the carnivores. The following utterance is very characteristic of Darwin. If man had not been his own classifier, he would never have thought of founding a separate order for his own reception. In numerous characters not mentioned in systematic works, in the features of the face, in the form of the nose, in the structure of the external ear, man resembles the ape. The arrangements of the hair in man has also much in common with the apes, as also the occurrence of hair on the forehead of the human embryo. The beard, the convergence of the hair of the upper and underarm towards the elbow, which occurs not only in the anthropoid apes, but also in some American monkeys. Darwin here adopts Wallace's explanation of the origin of the ascending direction of the hair in the forearm of the orang, that it has arisen through the habit of holding the hands over the head in rain. But this explanation cannot be maintained when we consider that this disposition of the hair is widely distributed among the most different mammals, being found in the dog, in the sloth, and in many of the lower monkeys. After further careful analysis of the anatomical character, Darwin reaches the conclusion that the New World monkeys may be excluded from the genealogical tree altogether, but that man is an offshoot from the Old World monkeys, whose progenitors existed as far back as the Miocene period. Among these Old World monkeys, the forms to which man shows the greatest resemblance are the anthropod apes, which, like him, possess neither tail nor ischial calistes. I don't know what it is. The Platyrine and Catarrhine monkeys have their primitive ancestor among extinct forms of the Lemuridae, or lemur, I think. Darwin also touches on the question of the original home of the human race and supposes that it may have been in Africa, because it is there that man's nearest relatives, the gorilla and the chimpanzee, are found. But he regards speculation on this point as useless. It is remarkable that, in this connection, Darwin regards the loss of the hair covering in man as having some relation to a warm climate, while elsewhere he is inclined to make sexual selection responsible for it. Darwin recognizes the great gap between man and his nearest relatives, but similar gaps exist at other parts of the mammalian genealogical tree. The allied forms have become extinct after the extermination of the lower races of mankind on the hand and of the anthropod apes on the other, which will undoubtedly take place. Okay. The gulf will be greater than ever, since the baboons will then bound it on the other side, and the white races on the other. That's a bit strange to be that specific. Little weight need be attached to the lack of fossil remains to fill up this gap, since the discovery of these depends upon chance. The last part of this chapter is devoted to a discussion of the earlier stages of the genealogy of man. Here Darwin accepts in the main the genealogical tree, which had meantime been published by Haeckel, who traces the pedigree back through Montrems, reptiles, amphibians, and fishes to Amphioxus, that's what we're calling it right now. Then follows an attempt to reconstruct from the atavastic characters a picture of our primitive ancestor, who was undoubtedly an arboreal animal. The occurrence of rudiments of parts in one sex which only come to full development in the other is next discussed. This state of things Darwin regards as derived from an original hermaphroditism. In regard to the mammary glands of the male, he does not accept the theory that they are vestigial, but considers them rather as not fully developed. The last chapter, part 1, deals with the question whether the different races of man are to be regarded as different species or as subspecies of a race of monophyletic origin. The striking differences between the races are first emphasized, and the question of the futility or infertility of hybrids is discussed. That fertility is the more usual is shown by the excessive fertility of the hybrid population of Brazil, This and the great variability of the distinguishing characters of the different races, as well as the fact that all grades of transition stages are found between these, while considerable general agreement exists, tell in favor of the unity of the races and lead to a conclusion that they all had a common primitive ancestor. Darwin therefore classifies all the different races as subspecies of one and the same species. Then follows an interesting inquiry into the reasons of the extinction of human races. He recognizes as the ultimate reason the injurious effects of a change of the conditions of life, which may bring about an increase in infantile mortality and a diminished fertility. It is precisely the reproductive system among animals also, which is most susceptible to changes in the environment. The final section of this chapter deals with the formation of the race of mankind. Darwin discusses the question how far the direct effect of different conditions of life or the inherited effects of increased use or disuse may have brought about the characteristic differences between the different races. Even in regard to the origin of the color of the skin, he rejects the transmitted effects of the original difference of climate as an explanation. In so doing, he is following his tendency to exclude Lamarckian explanations as far as possible. But here he makes gratuitous difficulties from which, since natural selection fails, there is no escape except by bringing in the principle of sexual selection, to which he regarded it as possible. Skin coloring, arrangement of hair, and form of features might be traced, but with his characteristic consciousness, he regards himself thus. I do not intend to assert that sexual selection will account for all the differences between the races. I may be permitted to remark as to Darwin's attitude towards Lamarck. Oh, that's why it says Lamarckian. Okay, I will be permitted a remark as to Darwin's attitude towards Lamarck. While at an earlier stage, when he was engaged in the preliminary labors of his immortal work, The Origin of Species, Darwin expressed himself very forcibly against the views of Lamarck, speaking of Lamarckian nonsense and of Lamarck's absurd, though clever word, and expressly declaring, I attribute very little to the direct action of climate, etc. Yet in later life he became more and more convinced of the influence of external conditions. In 1876, that is 2 years after the appearance of the second edition of The Descent of Man, he writes with his usual candid honesty, In my opinion, the greatest error which I have committed has been not allowing sufficient weight to the direct actions of the environment, i.e., food, climate, etc., independently of a natural selection. It is certain from this change of opinion that if he had been able to make up his mind to issue a third edition of The Descent of Man, he would have ascribed a much greater influence to the effect of external conditions in explaining the different characters of the race of man than he did in the second edition. He would also undoubtedly have attributed less influence to sexual selection as a factor in the origin of the different bodily characteristics, if indeed he would have excluded it altogether. In Part 3 of The Descent, 2 additional chapters are devoted to the discussion of sexual selection in relation to man. They may be very briefly referred to. Darwin here seeks to show that sexual selection has been operative on man and his primitive progenitor. Space fails me to follow out his interesting arguments. I can only mention that he is inclined to trace back hairlessness the development of the beard in man, and the characteristic color of the different human races to sexual selection. Since bareness of the skin could be no advantage, but rather a disadvantage, this character could not have been brought about by natural selection. Darwin also rejected a direct influence of climate as a cause of the origin of the skin color. I have already expressed the opinion, based on the development of his views as shown in his letters, that in a third edition Darwin would probably have laid more stress on the influence of external environment. He himself feels that there are gaps in his proofs here, and says in self-criticism, "The views here advanced on the part which sexual selection has played in the history of man want scientific precision." I need here only point out that it is impossible to explain the graduated stages of skin color by sexual selection, since it would have produced races sharply defined by their color and not united to other races by transition stages. And this, it is well known, is not the case. Moreover, the fact established by me that in all races the ventral side of the trunk is paler than the dorsal side, and the inner surface of the extremities paler than the outer side, cannot be explained by sexual selection in a Darwinian sense. With this I conclude my brief survey of the rich contents of Darwin's book. I may be permitted to conclude by quoting the magnificent final words of The Descent of Man. We must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy, which feels for the most debased, with benevolence, which extends not only to other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his god-like intellect, which has penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system. With all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. What has been the fate of Darwin's doctrines since his great achievement? How have they been received and followed up by the scientific and lay world? And what do the successors of the mighty hero and genius think now in regard to the origin of the human species? At the present time, we are incomparably more favorably placed than Darwin was for answering this question of all questions. We have at our command an incomparably greater wealth of material than he had at his disposal, and we are more fortunate than he in this respect, that we know now transition forms which help to fill up the gap, still great, between the lowest human races and the highest apes. Let us consider for a little the more essential additions to our knowledge since the publication of The Descent of Man. Since that time, our knowledge of animal embryos has increased enormously. While Darwin was obliged to content himself with comparing a human embryo with that of a dog, there are now available the youngest embryos of monkeys of all possible groups. Thanks to Selenka's most successful tour in the East Indies in search of such material, we can now compare corresponding stages of the lower monkeys and of the anthropoid apes with human embryos and convince ourselves of their great resemblance to one another, thus strengthening enormously the armor prepared by Darwin in defense of his view on man's nearest relatives. It may be said that Selenka's material fills up the blanks in Darwin's array of proofs in the most satisfactory manner. The deepening of our knowledge of comparative anatomy also gives us much surer foundations than those on which Darwin was obliged to build. Just of late, there have been many workers in the domain of the anatomy of apes and lemurs, and their investigations extended to the most different organs. Our knowledge of fossil apes and lemurs has also become much wider and more exact since Darwin's time. The fossil lemurs have been especially worked up by Cope, Forsyth, Major, Amagino, and others. Darwin knew very little about fossil monkeys. He mentioned 2 or 3 anthropoid apes as occurring in the Miocene of Europe, but only names the largest form from the Miocene of France. It was erroneously supposed that this form was related to Hylobates. 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 That's what we're calling it. We now know not only a form that actually stands near to the gibbon and remains of other arthropods, chimpanzees, but also several lower catarrhine monkeys, on which Mesopithecus, a form nearly related to the modern sacred monkeys, and found in strata of the Miocene period in Greece, is the most important. Quite recently, 2 Amaginos investigations have made us acquainted with fossil monkeys from South America, which, according to their discoverer, are to be regarded as in the line of human descent. What Darwin missed most of all, intermediate forms between apes and man, has been recently furnished. E. Du Bois is, as is well known, discovered in 1893 near Trinil in Java in the alluvial deposits of the river Bengawan, an important form represented by a skull cap, some molars, and a femur. His opinion, much disputed as it has been, that in this form, which he named Pithecanthropus, he has found a long-desired transition form, is shared by the present writer, and although the genealogical ape of these fossils, which, according to Du Bois, belong to the uppermost Tertiary series, the Phyllocene has recently been fixed at a later date, the Old Diluvium. The morphological value of these interesting remains, that is, the intermediate position of the Pithecanthropus, still holds good. Voles says with justice that even if Pithecanthropus is not the missing link, it is undoubtedly a missing link. As on the one hand, there has been found in Pithecanthropus a form which, though intermediate between apes and man, is nevertheless more closely allied to the apes. So, on the other hand, much progress has been made since Darwin's day in the discovery and description of the oldest human remains. Since the famous roof of a skull and the bones of the extremities belonging to it were found in 1856, the Neanderthal near Dusseldorf, the most varied judgments have been expressed in regard to the significance of the remains and of the skull in particular. In Darwin's Descent of Man, there is only a passing allusion to them in connection with the discussion of the skull capacity, although the investigations of Schaffhausen, King, and Huxley were then known. I believe I have shown in a series of papers that the skull in question belongs to a form different from any of the races of man now living, and with King and Cope I regard it as at least a different species from living man, and have therefore designated it Homo primigenus. The form unquestionably belongs to the older Diluvium, and in the later Diluvium human forms already appear, which agree in all essential points with existing human races. As far back as 1886, the value of the Neanderthal skull was greatly enhanced by Freypoint's discovery of 2 skulls and skeletons from Spy in Belgium. They are excellently described by their discoverer and are regarded as belonging to the same group of forms as the Neanderthal remains. In 1899 and the following years came the discovery by Gurjanovic Kramberger of different skeletal parts of at least 10 individuals in a cave near Kra, K-R-A, near Krapin in Croatia. It is in particular the form of the lower jaw which is different from that of all recent races of man, and which clearly indicates the lowly position of Homo primigenius, while on the other hand, the long-known skull from Gibraltar, which I have referred to Homo primigenius, and which has lately been examined in detail by Solus, has made us acquainted with the surprising shape of the eye orbit, of the nose, and of the whole upper part of the face. Isolated lower jaws found in La Naulette in Belgium and at Meland in France increase our material, which is now as abundant as could be desired. The most recent discovery of all is that of a skull dug up in August in the year 1908 by Klatsch and Hauser in the lower grotto of the Le Moister in southern France. But this skull has not yet been fully described. Thus, Homo primigenius must also be regarded as occupying a position in the gap existing between the highest apes and the lowest human races. Pithecanthropus standing in the lower part of it, and Homo primigenius in the higher, near man. In order to prevent misunderstanding, I should like here to emphasize that in arranging this structural series, anthropoid apes, Pithecanthropus, Homo primigenius, Homo sapiens, I have no intention of establishing it as a direct genealogical series. I shall have something to say in regard to the genetic relations of these forms, one to another, when discussing the different theories of descent current at the present day. And I think we'll stop there for part 2. Boy, some of those words were a mouthful. That brings us to the end of part 2 of Little Blue Book number 42, titled The Origin of the Human Race, written by G. Schwalbe. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 3.